Anika was a bright, dedicated young woman who had grown up in a middle-class neighborhood in India. From a young age, she had nurtured big dreams of making a difference in people's lives through medicine. Her family, though modest, was her anchor, providing her with a loving and supportive environment that encouraged her ambitions and made her feel like she could conquer any challenge. With hard work, she earned a place in medical school and threw herself into her studies with a determination that set her apart from her peers. Her friends admired her warmth and focus, while her professors saw in her the promise of a future doctor who could bring both skill and compassion to her patients. It was at a friend's celebration, in the middle of a semester that felt busier than ever, that Anika met Rahul. He was tall, striking, and surrounded by an aura of wealth and confidence that immediately set him apart. Rahul came from a billionaire family with a powerful reputation in the real estate industry. Used to luxury and privilege, he moved through life with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, accustomed to admiration and obedience from everyone he encountered. But there was something different about Anika. She was polite but distant, focused on her own path, and unfazed by his displays of wealth. For a man who rarely faced indifference, this reaction from Anika piqued Rahul's interest, sparking a curiosity that quickly turned into a relentless pursuit. Rahul began courting Anika with a fervor that left her both flattered and overwhelmed. Every week, he would show up with grand gestures, flowers by the dozen, elaborate dinners, and thoughtful, sometimes extravagant gifts. He showered her with compliments, painting a picture of a life filled with love, luxury, and excitement. Rahul promised her support in her medical career, assuring her that his family's wealth and influence could help her succeed beyond her wildest dreams. Though her instincts urged caution, Anika gradually allowed herself to feel drawn to him, intrigued by the stark contrast his life presented compared to her own. Her friends were both surprised and cautious, worried that she was stepping into a world vastly different from the one she knew, but she reassured them, believing that Rahul truly cared for her. As time passed, Rahul became a fixture in Anika's life, and their relationship deepened despite the concerns of her family, who were wary of the power dynamics that might come with marrying into such wealth. But when Rahul proposed, promising to protect and cherish her, Anika accepted, choosing to believe in the sincerity behind his grand gestures. Their engagement quickly became the talk of their town, and preparations for their wedding were underway. In March 2022, Anika and Rahul were married in a lavish ceremony that spared no expense. Hundreds of guests gathered to celebrate, marveling at the union between a brilliant young medical student and the son of one of the country's most powerful families. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfect. Anika was dazzled by the life of luxury she had stepped into, the sprawling mansion, the staff attending to her every need, the seemingly endless resources her new family possessed. The lifestyle was intoxicating and made her feel as though she was living in a fairy tale. Rahul was attentive, his family welcoming enough, and her mother-in-law even hinted at the pride they felt in her choice to become a doctor. For a while, she felt like she had made the right choice. But soon, the illusion began to fade. Rahul's temper, which she had previously seen only in rare flashes, started surfacing more frequently. It began with small, almost trivial annoyances. He would scold her for insignificant mistakes, criticize her friends and family, and express irritation whenever things didn't go exactly his way. Anika initially dismissed these incidents, thinking that perhaps he was simply under stress or adapting to married life. But his behavior grew progressively darker. What had started as minor scoldings evolved into aggressive criticism, belittling her in ways that left her stunned and shaken. His words cut deep, chipping away at her confidence and making her question herself. Eventually, Rahul's temper turned into physical violence. Anika was left stunned the first time he slapped her. She tried to reason with him, to remind him of their love and the vows they had taken, but he only laughed bitterly, blaming her for pushing him to such extremes. This pattern repeated itself. Rahul would lash out, often over something trivial, and then offer cold, insincere apologies that only made her feel more trapped. His words became a weapon, reinforcing his control over her and making her doubt her every action. Anika's attempts to reach out to her mother-in-law for help fell flat. Her mother-in-law was a quiet, detached woman who had grown accustomed to the power dynamics in her household. When Anika confided in her, hoping for some semblance of support, her mother-in-law simply brushed it off, telling her, "Men are like that. You must learn to accept it." Her cold response left Anika feeling more isolated than ever. In those first months of marriage, Anika watched her world shrink. The luxurious mansion that had once seemed a symbol of her new life began to feel like a gilded cage, a place where she was trapped under the watchful eyes of Rahul and his family. She found herself cut off from her friends, whom Rahul accused of being bad influences, and discouraged from speaking to her own family. His control tightened with every passing day, and Anika felt herself slipping away, her spirit dulled by the constant fear and uncertainty. But the most chilling realization came in the form of her father-in-law, Mr. Rakesh. A man of few words and an imposing presence, Mr. Rakesh was a force in the family, silently orchestrating the family's affairs. Though he was polite on the surface, there was a coldness in his eyes that made her uneasy. She avoided being alone with him whenever possible, feeling a subtle but growing sense of dread whenever he was around. One evening, as she sat alone in her room, there was a knock at the door. She opened it, only to find Mr. Rakesh standing there, a strange smile on his face. He entered without waiting for an invitation and began speaking softly about the importance of loyalty within their family. His words were veiled but unmistakable in their meaning. As he reached out to touch her shoulder, Anika felt a wave of terror, understanding that she was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. This man, the patriarch of her new family, saw her as something he owned, a possession to control and intimidate. It was in that moment, as she stood frozen under her father-in-law's cold gaze, that Anika realized just how powerless she was. In this house, her voice, her feelings, and her dignity meant nothing. She was alone, with no allies, and no escape in sight. The glamorous life she had once dreamed of had become a prison, each day stripping away another piece of who she once was. Anika's life within Rahul's family grew darker and more unbearable by the day. Initially, she held on to the hope that Rahul's behavior was a temporary phase, perhaps brought on by work stress or family expectations. But as days turned into weeks, she realized that things were only getting worse. Rahul's behavior became increasingly violent, revealing a deeply troubling side that she had never imagined. Rahul's outbursts were erratic and unpredictable, often triggered by trivial things, a casual comment she made to a servant, or the way she organized items around the house. At first, it was only raised voices, but his words turned sharper and more poisonous. He would berate her, saying she was worthless and owed everything to his family. The verbal abuse quickly escalated into physical confrontations. A slap here, a shove there, the blows were unpredictable, and the bruises they left were both on her skin and deep within her sense of self-worth. Gradually, Anika began to feel numb with fear. Anika came to realize that there was no one in this family she could turn to for support. She once thought her mother-in-law might offer some solace, some understanding, but she was sorely mistaken. Her mother-in-law, a reserved woman who seemed unfazed by the world around her, had no interest in helping her. On one occasion, when Anika tentatively spoke about her pain and fear, her mother-in-law merely looked at her with a blank expression and responded, "This is just how things are in this family. Learn to accept it." It was a chilling reminder that she was alone, isolated from the outside world by the walls of this luxurious mansion, surrounded by a family that wielded power like a weapon. Her father-in-law, Mr. Rakesh, was an imposing figure, a man who exuded a silent but unnerving authority. Despite his frequent absences, his presence was constantly felt, a reminder of the iron grip that held the family together. Then, one night, the nightmare reached an unbearable height. Anika was in her room when she heard a knock at the door. To her shock, it was Mr. Rakesh himself. His demeanor was calm, almost unsettlingly so, as he invited himself into her room under the guise of wanting to discuss a family matter. But as the conversation went on, his intentions became clear. He began to make advances, touching her in ways that made her skin crawl. Anika tried to resist, but the realization dawned on her that she was powerless. In this house, her voice meant nothing. Her cries would go unheard. This incident left her devastated and terrified. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, haunted by the image of her father-in-law's face and the sickening feeling of helplessness. Her sense of safety, her dignity, everything had been taken from her. She considered escaping, but the walls around her felt insurmountable. The family's influence stretched far beyond the house. Rahul and his father were powerful, with connections to local authorities, and Anika knew that any attempt to leave could lead to something far worse. The days that followed were a blur of fear and silence. Anika became a shell of the person she once was, walking on eggshells, constantly wary of Rahul's unpredictable temper and Mr. Rakesh's chilling presence. She had nowhere to turn, no one to confide in, as her life slipped further into a nightmarish existence. In those quiet, desperate moments, she remembered the girl she used to be, the ambitious medical student, the woman with dreams of helping others, of making a difference. It seemed like a distant memory, a life that belonged to someone else entirely. Trapped in the prison of her marriage, with no escape in sight, Anika struggled to hold on to a fragment of hope, though it grew fainter with each passing day. As the days passed, Anika's life turned into a cycle of fear, isolation, and despair. She began to see herself as a prisoner, trapped in a place where every door to freedom was guarded by wealth and influence that she could not compete with. The beatings and abuse from Rahul became frequent, and the sinister advances from her father-in-law, Mr. Rakesh, grew more brazen. Anika would lock herself in her room, her heart pounding with fear every time she heard footsteps approaching. The thought of escape became her only solace, but she knew that leaving the house was nearly impossible. Rahul had connections in law enforcement, and Mr. Rakesh's influence meant that even those who worked within the mansion were loyal to his family alone. Anika's mind became filled with plans and fantasies of escape. She would write letters to her family, but she never dared to send them, fearful that they would only bring harm to her loved ones. She reached out in secret to an old friend, hoping for some kind of guidance or rescue, but every message was intercepted, leaving her feeling more isolated and hopeless. Her friends from medical school had gradually drifted away, believing she was busy with her new life, unaware of the suffering she was enduring. One evening, after another vicious argument where Rahul accused her of being ungrateful for the life of privilege he provided, Anika realized that she could no longer stay silent. Her body was marked with bruises, her spirit depleted, but her will to survive flared once more. She decided to confide in one of the household staff, a young maid who had always shown her kindness and sympathy. Late at night, when the mansion was quiet, Anika found the maid in the kitchen and, with trembling hands, shared her story. The maid listened in horror, her face pale as she learned of Anika's suffering and the darkness within the family she served. "I will help you," the maid whispered, her voice trembling with fear and resolve. She promised to smuggle a letter to Anika's brother, a cry for help that might finally bring her the freedom she yearned for. Anika felt a glimmer of hope, something she had not felt in months, and clung to it with all her strength. She wrote the letter that night, her hands shaking as she poured her anguish and desperation onto the page, pleading with her family to intervene, to help her escape before it was too late. But tragedy struck before her plea for help could ever reach her family. The next morning, Mr. Rakesh summoned Anika to his office. She entered the room with a sense of dread, feeling the walls close in around her. He held the letter in his hand, a twisted smile on his face as he revealed that he knew everything. The maid, terrified and confronted by Mr. Rakesh's men, had been forced to hand over the letter, betraying Anika under duress. Anika's heart shattered as Mr. Rakesh spoke calmly about the consequences of betrayal. He reminded her of the family's power and control, of the reach they had over every aspect of her life. There would be no escape, he told her with a chilling certainty. Her only option was submission, a life trapped in the house, and any attempt to defy him would be met with punishment she could hardly imagine. That night, Anika lay in her room, feeling utterly defeated. Her last hope had been snuffed out, leaving her in the clutches of a family that saw her as nothing more than a pawn, an object to be controlled and silenced. A few days later, on June 16, 2022, Anika vanished. Her family grew increasingly worried when they didn't hear from her, and they began calling and messaging her repeatedly. But Rahul's family offered only vague excuses, insisting she had gone away to clear her mind and would return soon. Days passed, and Anika's absence became more troubling, leading her family to fear the worst. Then, 3 days after her disappearance, a call came that shattered her family's world. Anika's body had been found, dismembered, in the Ganges River. The shock of her death sent ripples of grief and outrage through her community, with her family devastated by the horror of her fate. They knew, without a doubt, that her husband's family was responsible, but local authorities were reluctant to investigate, intimidated by the power wielded by Rahul's father. They tried to file a report, to demand justice for their daughter, but every effort seemed to meet an invisible barrier. The influence and money of Rahul's family created an unspoken silence around the case, a silence that threatened to bury Anika's story forever. Heartbroken and desperate, Anika's brother took to social media, sharing the tragic details of her story with the public. He wrote about the abuse she had endured, the suffering she had tried to escape, and the powerful family that sought to silence her forever. His posts spread like wildfire, sparking a public outcry that reverberated across the country. People were appalled and angered, horrified by the abuse of power that had stolen the life of a young, promising woman. Under mounting pressure, central authorities were forced to intervene, launching an official investigation that finally brought the spotlight onto Rahul and his family. Evidence surfaced, painting a damning picture of the violence and manipulation Anika had endured. Her diary, recovered from her belongings, was filled with heartbreaking accounts of the abuse, of the nights spent in terror, and the dreams of escape she had clung to. Testimonies from servants, too, shed light on the horrors that had occurred behind the mansion's walls, revealing the oppressive environment that had driven her to such despair. Anika's case became a national scandal, a tragic tale of how power and privilege could hide the darkest of crimes. Yet, amid the public support, her family faced a painful truth: no matter how much outrage or evidence they gathered, Anika was gone forever. Her story, a story of hope turned to horror, of dreams crushed by cruelty, echoed as a warning across the nation. Her family's fight for justice was only beginning, but Anika's life had already been lost, a young woman's future snatched away by those who saw her as disposable, an inconvenient truth they sought to erase. The tragic death of Anika sent shockwaves across the nation, stirring a collective sense of outrage and disbelief. Her family, despite their grief, became determined to expose the truth. Fueled by public support and the painful memories of a vibrant young woman, they pushed forward, undeterred by the overwhelming power of Rahul's family. The story spread widely, with news channels, activists, and public figures rallying behind Anika's family, demanding justice for a life brutally cut short. Anika's brother played a pivotal role in this quest for justice. He tirelessly campaigned, sharing every detail of her story with the public and speaking out against the corruption and power imbalance that had allowed his sister's suffering to go unnoticed for so long. His heartbreaking posts and interviews brought light to the abuse she had endured and inspired a wave of solidarity, with citizens across the country calling for accountability. He spoke with conviction, recounting the anguish his family felt and the sorrow of losing someone who had once been a symbol of hope, kindness, and ambition. Under intense pressure, central authorities launched a thorough investigation into Anika's death. Investigators uncovered a dark web of manipulation, corruption, and violence, a reality that had long been shielded by the wealth and influence of Rahul's family. Anika's diary, which contained detailed accounts of the abuse she endured, served as a crucial piece of evidence. The diary entries painted a picture of a young woman who, despite her fear, had fought hard to hold on to hope and strength. She wrote about her dreams of escape, her longing to reunite with her family, and the oppressive, soul-crushing environment she was trapped in. Servants and staff members also came forward, offering testimonies that shed light on the horrors Anika had endured within the mansion's walls. They described how she was isolated from the outside world, forbidden from speaking to her loved ones, and subjected to an unending cycle of violence and manipulation. Many of the servants had feared retaliation, but the public outcry and media attention emboldened them, allowing the truth to finally come to light. Their stories revealed a household governed by fear and control, where the rules were dictated by Mr. Rakesh and enforced with an iron hand. As the investigation progressed, the story captured the nation's attention. People from all walks of life expressed their outrage, condemning not only the violence inflicted on Anika but also the corruption that had allowed it to remain hidden for so long. Citizens held vigils, lit candles in Anika's memory, and took to social media, using hashtags and organizing rallies demanding justice. It was no longer just about Anika's death. It had become a symbol of the pervasive abuse of power, the injustices faced by women, and the urgent need for change in a society that too often shielded the privileged from accountability. In December, the trial commenced, drawing national attention as it brought the ugly truths of the case into the courtroom. The evidence against Rahul and Mr. Rakesh was overwhelming: Anika's diary, the testimonies of the servants, and the bruises and scars that had been documented on her body spoke volumes about the horrors she had endured. The courtroom was tense, filled with spectators, journalists, and activists eager to witness justice for Anika. Her family, sitting at the front, wore expressions of grief and determination, clinging to the hope that this trial would finally bring accountability for those who had wronged her. After weeks of testimony and evidence presentation, the judge handed down a verdict that was met with mixed reactions. Mr. Rakesh was sentenced to life in prison for his direct involvement in Anika's abuse and for orchestrating her silence. Rahul, however, received a lighter sentence, 15 years for his role in the abuse and negligence leading up to her death. The leniency shown to Rahul sparked immediate backlash from the public, who saw it as yet another example of wealth and influence shielding the privileged from the full weight of justice. The sentence ignited a firestorm of public criticism. News outlets ran editorials questioning the integrity of the justice system, while activists organized protests demanding stricter punishments for those who wielded power to inflict harm. Social media was flooded with messages of support for Anika's family, alongside condemnation of the perceived injustice in Rahul's sentencing. People called for reforms to ensure that future cases involving the wealthy and powerful would not be met with the same leniency, highlighting the deep-seated issues within the legal system. For Anika's family, the trial's conclusion was bittersweet. They had won a partial victory in securing life imprisonment for Mr. Rakesh, but the lighter sentence for Rahul left them with a sense of incomplete justice. Her brother, though heartbroken, vowed to continue fighting in her name, advocating for changes in the legal system and raising awareness about domestic violence and abuse of power. He became a powerful voice, speaking to media outlets and working with organizations to promote legislative reforms that would protect the vulnerable and prevent future tragedies like his sister's. Anika's case became a turning point, sparking conversations and debates on a national level about the flaws within the justice system, the need for greater accountability, and the importance of safeguarding those who suffer in silence. In the wake of her story, lawmakers proposed new legislation aimed at protecting individuals from abuse within powerful families, closing loopholes that allowed wealth to shield people from consequences. Activists and social advocates used Anika's story as a rallying point, reminding society of the importance of speaking up and supporting those who find themselves trapped in dangerous situations. Anika's legacy lived on through the impact her story had on society. Her face became a symbol of resilience and courage, a reminder of the countless individuals who endure abuse in silence. Schools, universities, and community centers began organizing workshops and awareness campaigns, emphasizing the importance of recognizing the signs of abuse and offering support to those in need. Her story was retold in newspapers, documentaries, and public speeches, ensuring that her life, though tragically cut short, would serve as a lasting call for change. In the end, Anika's family found solace in the knowledge that her story had sparked a movement, that her suffering had not been in vain. While nothing could bring her back, her legacy had become a beacon of hope for others, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power and influence, the voices of the oppressed could still bring about change. Anika's name became synonymous with resilience, justice, and the fight for a society that would no longer allow the privileged to harm the powerless with impunity.